Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is an AMD FX 4170 processor. Like the other FX series chips in the lineup, it has no integrated graphics. However, some of the AM3 Plus motherboards that were available for this chip did have integrated graphics built right into the board, and today, after messing around with the FX 4170, I couldn't help but wonder, well, can you game on these integrated HD graphics? So this board in particular, this entry-level ASRock model here, features HD 4200 Radeon graphics, and to be honest, well, as a lot of you are probably expecting right off of the bat, they're not very good. These graphics do, however, support Windows 10. Now, I didn't think they did at first. I read all sorts of stories online whereby people had to use Windows 8 drivers or even Windows 7 drivers or just Windows 7 in order to get these working. And, well, I really thought that Windows 10 was going to cause problems, but after a few initial issues when booting up, namely a problem where apparently the boot device was inaccessible, I restarted into safe mode, installed the chipset drivers for this motherboard, followed by an old version of the Catalyst Control Center, I believe version 13.1, but I'll put the exact version up on screen just to confirm, and well, they installed as normal, no trouble. After this, I double checked to make sure that we had the HD 4200 drivers installed, and as you can see, I'll throw up the FX 4170 specs on here as well. So the FX 4170, it was an okay enough chip back in the day for gaming and basic usage. Well, for the money, it was fine. Intel's alternatives, however, did prove to be the better buy, and in terms of longevity, well, I think it's safe to say that the Intel alternatives are probably still hanging in there a little bit better than the FX counterparts. But we're not here to discuss comparisons today. We're here to see what the integrated motherboard graphics on this ASRock board can actually do. So, the HD 4200, it supports DX10. We have 256 megabytes of shared DDR2 to play with, and I'm sure from what you've seen so far, well, you can guess which way this video is going, but let's jump into a few supported titles and see. So, in terms of the BIOS, we'll take a quick look at the BIOS first of all. We've done nothing special with the 4170. We have paired it with 4 gigs of RAM. We don't really need any more than that because the GPU will actually be the bottleneck here. The integrated motherboard graphics will be holding us back. So we've paired the chip with 4 gigabytes of DDR3 today. There's not much else to look at in the BIOS here. I just wanted to show you that we are only using the motherboard and the FX chip. Now, the first game I jumped into was Far Cry 2. Now, for most of these titles, I tried to keep the native screen resolution of 1360 by 768. We had to use the smaller monitor today for compatibility reasons, and in Far Cry 2 with the HD 4200, well, we averaged about 22 FPS during the benchmark run. We ran this benchmark 3 times. I haven't got any exact figures on screen for you today because, to be honest, I started out not putting too much effort into this. I thought it would immediately be a disaster, but for the games to run, or for our first game to run anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves, well, I was honestly quite surprised. Far Cry 2 can be notoriously demanding for some hardware, and here it ran fine-ish. Fine for the specs, let's be honest. Now, Crysis, well, the in-game menu certainly ran very well over 100 FPS, but here it was time to set things to low to give us the best chance. Now, when it came to actual gameplay, although the game does look pretty horrible, there's popping everywhere, and the difference between low and very high in this game really is night and day. It's probably one of the biggest differences still to this day in terms of how good or bad a game can look. Now, again, at 1360 by 768, we were averaging about 15 frames per second. There really wasn't much to talk about here. What I will say, though, is that even at 800 by 600, there really wasn't much of a difference. You may see an extra 2 or 3 frames, but when you're only running at 14 or 15, it doesn't help out too much. And as soon as things get quite intensive on screen, well, you might see drops into single figures. So yeah, again though, I'm quite surprised that we even were able to start Crysis, and there will be points where the frame rate does jump into the mid-20s. At one point, and you probably won't believe me, I wouldn't believe me. Well, I looked up at the sky and saw 32 FPS. What a result! So GTA 4, it's notoriously unoptimised, and as you can see here, the in-game menu ran at over 200 frames per second, but I decided it was best to turn everything down to low. Now you can set the amount of shared memory in the BIOS. I chose 512 megabytes in the end, but I did experiment with all of the settings and there really wasn't much difference to be seen. I think the PC just decides on its own what it's going to do, to be honest, to avoid any technical terminology there. But even so, the game didn't really run with more than 10 frames per second. However, I did then switch things to 800 by 600 once again, as I did throughout, just to see if there was any difference. And in GTA 4, there was a noticeable difference. We actually saw about 15, 16 frames per second. Again, it wasn't what I'd call playable because there were too many drops and stutters here and there. A lot of the time, the cars would just continue accelerating even if you let go of the keys. It was a pretty unplayable experience, but that's to be expected. The successor to GTA 4, GTA 5, which actually runs better on some modern hardware, well, didn't run better here. 800 by 600 once again, forgive the stretched widescreen here, that seemed to be the default for this setup, but we were seeing less than 10 frames per second, and just like in GTA 4, we saw a lot of graphical problems, one of which was this right here. Now, I was actually holding down the W key still to accelerate, but the car just decided to stop. Now eventually I was able to move from this car to a different one and the same thing happened. I wasn't actually able to drive anywhere or get out the car once I had got in it, so that's a very weird glitch. I don't know quite why that happened, but if you plan to play GTA 5 on the HD 4200 integrated motherboard graphics, well, not only will your frame rate be horribly low, but it will be quite glitchy. So we should probably talk about CSGO. Forgive the framing on this one, but a 640 by 480 isn't really supported by this LG monitor, or at least it doesn't fit in the screen properly no matter how many adjustments I try to make. What I will say though is that CSGO ran with an average of about 28 frames per second. This was the most playable result so far. So CSGO on the FX 4170 and integrated motherboard graphics, well, you're going to have a, not good, but you're going to have a playable, not really, you're going to have a, the game will run. The game will run with close to 30 FPS, put it that way. That's all I can really say on the matter, but yeah, it was surprising. And finally, let's talk about some classic titles now, or one classic title in particular, GTA San Andreas. Now this again was quite demanding on this hardware. You'll be surprised that if you turn the settings way up to very high on some hardware that San Andreas can actually give your PC quite a hard time, especially if you have the anti-aliasing settings turned up too. Now thankfully we had anti-aliasing off, and in a minute I actually dropped things down to 800 by 600 and the frame rate more than doubled pretty much. With the very high settings at 1360 by 768 you're going to see roughly 30 with a lot, and I mean a lot of stutter, but as I said before, if we jump into the settings, we'll turn the visual FX down to low, and we'll also turn the resolution down to 800 by 600 as well, whilst leaving anti-aliasing off. Now the performance in game, well, it certainly improves to say the least, and this is the best way to play GTA San Andreas. I remember playing this on my mum's PC many years ago now with the Intel GMA graphics, and I think I had to use very similar settings, but there we go. The HD 4200 integrated AMD motherboard graphics. Can you game with them? Sort of. If you want to play San Andreas and CSGO and don't mind occasionally very low frame rates, then so be it. Now during the editing of this video I noticed a mistake that I mentioned. I said that the graphics installed without any problems, and there weren't actually any Windows 10 graphics available. I had to install the Windows 8 64-bit drivers, version 13.1, the legacy drivers. I didn't have to enable any compatibility mode, I just installed the AMD chipset drivers first. You can go to the AMD website and download version 18.1 of the chipset drivers for this board. That's what I recommend doing before installing the graphics drivers. I don't know if it means that the graphics drivers install without fault, but that's the order I did things, and I had literally no trouble when doing so, despite what I had read on the subject. So the HD 4200 graphics still do seem to work with Windows 10, though you may be limited to lower or strange resolutions, which might not bode well with a modern 1080p or widescreen display. All that's left to say for this video though is, well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.